Book 2, The Lands of California, Stave 4. Management of the California State Lands. We have seen what federal legislation has done to inflict the curse of land monopoly upon California. Let us now see what has been done by the state herself. We shall find that, as reckless as have been the dealings of the general government with our lands, the dealings of the state have been even worse. And here let it be remarked that for most of these wrong acts of the federal government, the people of California are themselves largely responsible. For the public manifestation of a strong sentiment here could not have failed to exert great influence upon Congress. But, for instance, instead of objecting to railroad grants, we have, for the most part, hailed them as evidence of congressional liberality. When the Southern Pacific had once forfeited its grant, the California legislature asked Congress to give it back without suggesting a single restriction on the sale or management of the lands. In 1870, a bill actually passed the House, reserving the public lands of California for homestead entry, as the lands of the southern states had been reserved. Still, it went over in the Senate on the objection of Senator Nye of Nevada. There is little doubt that the manifestation of a strong desire on our part would, at any time, secure the passage of such a bill. The specific grants made to California, in common with other land states, which have been before enumerated, amount to an aggregate of 7,421,804 acres, an area almost as large as that of Massachusetts and Connecticut combined. Besides these grants, all the swamplands are given to the state for purposes of reclamation, of which 3,381,691 acres have already been sold, about all there is. These large donations have proved an evil rather than a benefit to the people of California, for in disposing of them, the state has given even greater facilities for monopoly than has the federal government. And the practical effect of the creation of two sources of title to public land has been to harass settlers and to give opportunity for a great deal of robbery and rascality. The land policy of the state of California must be traced through some 35 or 40 acts, in whose changes and technicalities the non-expert will soon become bewildered. It is only necessary here to give its salient features. It must be understood in the first place that the only grant of specific pieces of land is that of the 16th and 36th sections of each township. When these are occupied or otherwise disposed of, other sections are given in lieu of them. These lieu lands, as well as the lands granted in specific amounts, the state has had the privilege of taking from any unappropriated government land, the ownership of the swamp lands being decided by the nature of the land itself. With this large floating grant, as it may be termed, the general policy of the state has been not to select the lands and then to sell them, but in effect to sell to individuals its right of selection. Now, under the general laws of the United States, until land is offered at public sale, there is no way of getting title to it save by actual settlement, and then in tracts of not over 160 acres to each individual. And though since 1862 the preemption right has applied to unsurveyed lands, yet until land is surveyed and the plats filed, the settler can make no record of his preemption. To this land, thus reserved by the general laws for the small farms of actual settlers, the state grants gave an opportunity of obtaining title without regard to settlement or amount, an opportunity which speculators have well improved. In defiance of the laws of the United States and even of the act admitting California into the Union, the state at first sold even unsurveyed land. This policy continued until the courts declared it illegal in 1863. In 1852, to dispose of the 500,000-acre grant, which the Constitution of the state gave to the school fund, warrants were issued purchasable at $2 per acre in depreciated scrip, and locatable on any unoccupied government land, surveyed or unsurveyed. These warrants, however, were not saleable to any person in amounts of more than 640 acres, and the buyer had to make an affidavit that he intended to make permanent settlement on the land. But as the warrants were assignable and affidavits cheap, these restrictions were of but little avail. Passing for the most part into the hands of speculators, the warrants enabled them to forestall the settler, and even, in many cases, to take his farm from him. For though, by the terms of the law, the warrants could only be laid on unoccupied land, yet when once laid, they were prima facie evidence of title. The difficulty could be overcome only by collusion with county officers and false affidavits. These school land warrants have been a terror to the California settler. Many a man who has made himself a home, relying upon the general laws of the federal government, has seen the results of his years of toil and privation pass into the hands of some soulless cormorant, who, without his knowledge, had plastered over his farm with school land warrants. The law under which the warrants were issued was repealed in 1858. The policy adopted of settling the state title to applicants for land in amounts not to exceed 320 acres to each individual, at the rate of $1.25 per acre, payable either in cash or 20% in cash, and the balance on credit with interest at 10%. The 16th and 36th sections, or the lands in lieu of them, were at first given to the respective townships, to be sold for the benefit of the township school fund, but were afterwards made sellable as other lands for the benefit of the general fund. The swamp lands were, from the first, made saleable in tracts not exceeding 320 acres to each person, for $1 per acre, cash or credit. The proceeds to be applied to the reclamation of the land, under regulations varied by different laws, from time to time. This was virtually giving them away, the true policy. But the trouble is that for the most part they have been given to a few men. Up to 1868, the state had always, in words at least, recognized the principle that one man should not be permitted to take more than a certain amount of land. But by the Act of March 28th of that year, which repealed all previous laws and is still, with some trifling amendments, the land law of the state, all restrictions of amount, except as to the 16th and 36th sections proper, were swept away. And with reference to those lands, the form of affidavit was so changed that the applicant was not required to swear that he wanted the land for settlement, or wanted it for himself. This act has some good features, but from the enacting clause to the repealing section, its central idea seems to be the making easy of land monopolization and the favoring of speculators at the expense of settlers. In addition to sweeping away the restrictions as to amount and to use, it provided that the settlers upon the 16th and 36th sections should only be protected in their occupancy for 6 months after the passage of the Act, after which the protection should only be for 60 days. It changed the affidavit previously required, from a denial of other settlement to a denial of a valid adverse claim. Under this provision, a regular business has been driven in robbing settlers of their homes. Unless a new law is very generally discussed in the newspapers, and land laws seldom are, it takes a long time for the people to become acquainted with it. There were many settlers on state land who knew nothing of the limitation until they received notification that somebody else had possession of a clear title to their farms. Did space permit, numbers of cases of this kind of robbery might be cited, some of them of widows and orphans, whose all was ruthlessly taken from them. But I will confine myself to one case of recent occurrence, where the looked-for plunder is considerable. The town of Amador and the very valuable Keystone Mine are situated on the east half of a 36th section. The survey which developed this fact was only made in the early part of the present year. The deputy surveyor, who was evidently in the plot, returned to the United States Land Office the plat of the township, with the mine and the town marked in the west half. Application was at the same time made to the State Surveyor General, in the name of Henry Casey, for the east half. In regular course, the Surveyor General sent the application to the United States Land Office, whence it was returned, with a certificate that the land was free, whereupon the Surveyor General approved the application and 25 cents per acre was paid the state. And thus, for $80 cash and $32 per annum interest, a little knot of speculators has secured title to the Keystone Mine, worth at least $1 million, and the whole town of Amador, besides. And as further evidence of the recklessness of California land legislation and of the lengths to which the land grabbers are prepared to go, two facts may be cited. The last legislature, instead of repealing or removing the objectionable features from this green law, actually passed a special bill legalizing all applications for state lands, even where the affidavits by which they were supported did not conform to the requirements of the law, either in form or in substance. After this had been passed, on the last day of the session, a bill was passed and signed by the governor, designed to restrict applicants for lieu lands to 320 acres. But after the legislature had adjourned, when the act came to be copied in the Secretary of State's office, 10, and behold, it was discovered that the engrossed and signed copy did not contain this provision. Yet, to understand fully what a premium the state has offered for the monopolization of her school lands, there is another thing to be explained. To purchase land of the state, an application must be filed in the State Land Office, describing the land by range, township, and section, and stating under what grant the title is asked. This application must be accompanied by a fee of $5. The Surveyor General then issues a certificate to the applicant and sends the application to the United States Land Office for certification that the land is free before he approves the application and demands payment for the land. If there is no record in his office of preemption, homestead, or other occupation, the United States Register thereupon marks the land off on his map. Still, he does not certify to the State Surveyor General until he gets his fee. The State Surveyor General has no appropriation to pay the fee, although the present incumbent asked for one in his first report. So the payment of the fee and the return of the United States certificate depend upon the applicant, whose interest it is, of course, not to get lit until he wishes to pay for his land. And thus, by the payment of $5, a whole section of United States land can be shut up from the settler. There are 1,244. 96 acres monopolized in California today in this way. For thousands and thousands of acres, which are offered for sale on California and Montgomery streets, there is no other title than the payment of this $5. When the immigrant buys of the speculator for $2, $5, $10, or $20 an acre, as the case may be, then the speculator goes to the United States Land Office, pays the register's fee, gets his certificate and the State Surveyor General's approval, and pays the state $1.25 per acre. Or, if with the immigrant he has made a bargain of that kind, he pays 25 cents per acre and leaves his purchaser to pay the dollar at some future time with interest at 10%. Swampland grabbing. And as the speculator has had a far better opportunity in dealing with the state than with the United States, there has been every inducement to get as much land as possible under the jurisdiction of the state by declaring it swampland. The certificate of United States officers as to the character of the land has not been waited for. Still, the state has sold to every purchaser who would get the county surveyor to segregate the land he wanted, and procure a couple of affidavits as to its swampy character. Probably one half of the land sold, or rather given as the money is returned, by the state as swamp is not swamp at all, but good dry land that has been sworn to as swamp in order to take it out of the control of the preemption laws of the United States. The state has been made the cat's paw of speculators, and her name used as the cover under which the richest lands in California might be monopolized and settlers robbed. The seizure of these lands of the state, or rather by speculators in the name of the state, is, for the most part, entirely illegal. Still, by the Act of 1866, previous seizures were confirmed, and the land grabbers of California were. However, Mr. Julian occasionally makes them some trouble, has powerful friends in Washington, and unless energetic remonstrance is made, generally gets what they ask. This swamp land grant has not yielded a cent to the state, but it has enabled speculators to monopolize hundreds of thousands of acres of the most valuable lands in California, and, of course, to rob settlers. For the settler, though he has a right under United States laws, can get no record nor evidence of title until his land is surveyed and the plats filed. In the meantime, if the speculator comes along and can get a couple of affidavits as to the swampy character of the settler's farm, he has been able to buy the title of the state. Lands thousands of feet above the level of the sea have been purchased as swamp. Lands over which a heavily loaded wagon can be driven in the month of May, and even lands which cannot be cultivated without irrigation. Sierra Valley is in Plumas County, in the very heart of the mountains. Standing on its edge, you may, at your option, toss a biscuit into a stream, which finally sinks in the Great Nevada Basin, or into the waters that join the Pacific. When the snow melts in the early spring, the mountain streams which run through the valley overflow and spread over a portion of the land. But after a freshet has passed, water has to be turned in through irrigating ditches to enable the lands to produce their most valuable crop, hay. The valley is filled with preemption and homestead settlers, who, besides their own homes and improvements, have built 2 churches and 7 schoolhouses. Many of their farms are worth $20 per acre. The swampland robbers cast their eyes on this pretty little valley and its thrifty settlement, and the first thing the settlers knew, their farms had been bought of the state as swamplands, and the United States was asked to list them over. Energetic remonstrance was made, and the matter was referred by the department to the United States Surveyor General to take testimony. His investigation has just been concluded, and the attempted grab has probably failed, but in hundreds of cases, similar ones on a smaller scale have succeeded. Another recent attempt has been made to get hold of 46,000 acres adjoining Sacramento. This land was formerly overshadowed by the rejected Sutter grant, and for some time has been all preempted. About a year ago it was surveyed, and the plats returned to the United States Land Office. With this land marked as swamp, applications were being made at the same time to the state for the land. The ex-Surveyor General, Sherman Day, signed the plats, and the land had actually been listed over by the department, when a protest was made and forwarded to Washington, accompanied by his own personal testimony, by the new Surveyor General, Hardenberg, who, having been long a resident of Sacramento, knew the character of the land. This forced the suspension of the lists, very much, it seems, to the indignation of the acting commissioner of the General Land Office, W. W. Curtis, who wrote a letter to the Surveyor General, which has been published in the newspapers, which is a curiosity of official impudence, and which betrays a very suspicious anger with what the acting commissioner seems to consider the interference of the Surveyor General. Mr. Julian, in his speech entitled Swamp Land Swindles, has detailed how a party of speculators, one of whom was ex-State Surveyor General Houghton, and another the son of the then United States Surveyor General Upson, got hold of 16,000 acres in Colusa, as to the dry character of which he gives affidavits under the swampland laws by having the survey of 2 townships made and approved in a few days, just before the map of the California and Oregon Railroad Company was filed. These swampland speculators are, in many cases, attempting to shelter themselves behind the growing feeling against railroad grants. Still, Bad as the railroad grants are, the operations of these speculators are worse. The railroad companies can only take half the lands. The speculators take it all. The railroad companies cannot easily disturb previous settlers, but the speculators take the settlers' homes from under their feet. Who have our lands? The State Surveyor General ought to give in his next report, and if he does not, the legislature ought to call for it, a list of the amounts of state lands taken in large quantities by single individuals with their names under the Act of 1868. Such a list would go far to open the eyes of the people of California to the extent their state government has been used to foster the land monopoly of which they are beginning to complain. Yet such a list would not fully show what has been done, as a great deal of land has been taken by means of dummies. Of the 16th and 36th sections proper, to which even now one individual cannot apply for more than 320 acres, one speculator has secured 8,000 acres in Colusa County alone. Among those who have secured the largest amount from the state, either in their own names or as attorneys for others, are W. S. Chapman, George W. Roberts, ex-Surveyor General Houghton, John Mullen, Will S. Green, H. C. Logan, George H. Thompson, B. F. Malden, I. N. Chapman, Leander Ransom, N. N. Clay, James W. Shanklin, and E. H. Miller. The larger amounts secured by single individuals range from 20,000 acres to over 100,000.